Hey, this is Algebra 1, Section 2.5, multiplying or multiplication of real numbers. A couple of goals we have: multiplying real numbers using properties of multiplication, and we're going to look at some real life examples on page 93 is where it begins in the text. First thing we have is a box that talks about the sign of a product. When we're talking about sign, it either means they're going to be a negative or a positive value at the end. Most of the time, when you're dealing with this, you're talking about either multiplying two things or multiplying three things or exponents. But this goes ahead and it just groups everything together. It says a product is negative if it has an odd number of negative factors. So any odd number, if you have one negative value or three or five or seven, you know what odd numbers are. It's going to be negative if that's how many negative values you have. Uh, if you have a positive or an even amount, it's going to be positive, meaning that there are two negatives most of the time. Like I said, when you multiply a negative times a negative, that's two of them. That's going to be a positive value. That's most of the time when you're looking at it, it's going to look that way. So again, this is just a way to group everything together and say that when there's an odd number of negatives, it's going to be negative, and when there's an even number of negatives, it's going to be positive. Okay, so example number one talks about that. 2 times 3, there are 0 negative factors. Now, we didn't talk about 0 a minute ago. We talked about odds. We talked about an odd amount and we talked about an even amount. 0 is neither odd nor even, but there are no negative factors at all. No negative factors means two positives or any amount of positive numbers. So it's going to be a positive product. 2 times 3 is 6. When you're talking about two negative factors, notice there's two of them. One of them, two of them. It doesn't matter. At the end, you're going to have a different number for each one of these, but it doesn't matter. You can tell right away if it's going to be positive or negative based on how many negative values there are. If it's an even amount, again, they're going to be positive. Odd amount, it's going to be negative. When you multiply 7 times 7, you get 49. Times 2 is 98. Okay? There are 5 negative factors. Notice there's only one negative 2 shown and one negative 1 shown. But negative 2 is being multiplied by itself 3 times because it's being cubed. So that's 3 negatives. Negative 1 is being multiplied by itself twice. So that's 2 more negatives. So that's how we get the number 5 negatives. That's an odd amount. Therefore, it's going to be negative. You know, 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. And then it doesn't matter how many times you multiply 1 by itself, you're still going to get 1. But the important part is to note that since there are 5 of them, it will be negative 8 and not positive 8. And then D says negative 3 squared minus 5 equals 45. Now, the difference between C and D is only the 3 is being raised to the second power here. Only the 3, not the negative 3. Remember, if it like on C, negative 2 is being raised to the third power. That's negative times negative times negative. For D, it's just 3 times 3 times 3, which gives you the number 9, and that becomes negative 9 because the negative comes down in front of it. So negative 9 times negative 5, that's 2 negative factors, which is an even amount. That's why it's a positive value. Okay, take about a minute and do these 4. You have plenty of room on the back of that sheet. Okay, we have four different problems here. The first one, 9 times negative 3. There's one negative value. That's an odd amount of negatives. So at the end of this problem, it's going to be negative. When you multiply 9 times 3, you get 27. For B, there are two negative values. You can count them up. There's one here, two here. That's an even amount. So at the end of this problem, it's going to be positive with an even amount. 8 times 1/2 means half of 8, which is 4, and 4 times 6 is 24. And again, we said it was an even amount, positive 24. Letter C says negative 3 to the third power. Now, the negative value is being raised to the third power. That's the same thing as negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. So there's an odd amount of them there. Odd amount means at the end it's going to be a negative value. 3 times 3 is 9, and 9 times 3 is 27. And then for D, there are four negative values. You can count them up. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. That's an even amount, which means it's going to be positive at the end. 2 times 1/2, or half of 2, is 1. 1 times 3 is 3. And 3 times 5 is 15. Example number 2 talks about variable products. You're doing the same thing, except now you don't have numbers or you don't have values to represent these. All you can do is count the number of negative values. There are two negative values, or negative signs, I should say, since values doesn't really work here. But negative signs. There's 1, 2. That's an even amount. Negative times negative gives you positive xy. For the second one, you have negative times negative. Again, when you multiply a times a, you add, and we'll get to this eventually, you add the exponents 1 plus 1, and that's why it says a squared. But again, there are two of them, and that's why it's positive. For C, you have 1, 2, 3 of them. You can count them. 1 for negative 9, 2 for negative a, 3 for negative b. So you know at the end of this, it's going to be negative. Negative 9 times a times b, written negative 9ab. 3 negative signs, odd amount, negative at the end. Okay, take about a minute to do these four. For letter A, it says negative n times negative n. That's two negative values, or two negative signs. So that means it's an even amount. At the end, it's going to be a positive n squared, n times n. For letter B, it says negative 4 times negative x times negative x times x. There are 1, 2, 3 negative values. That's an odd amount. So at the end, it's going to be a negative value. 4, and you add x to the first plus 1, x to the 1 plus 1 plus 1 gives you x to the third, negative 4x to the third. But see, it says negative b to the third. Now the difference, this is the kind of problem that messes with a lot of people C, because only b is being raised to the third power. So this is the same thing as negative. Remember, your order of operations tells you to do exponents, when you look at it this way, exponents before multiplication and division. So before you multiply that negative outside that parentheses times b, you need to do b times b times b, like this. B times b times b is b to the third, and then the negative comes down in front of it. So negative b to the third. And then negative y to the fourth. Now negative y is being raised to the fourth power, which means negative y times itself 4 times. That means there are 4 negative exponents, or there are 4 negative signs. That's an even amount. Even means it's going to be positive at the end, and it's y to the fourth power. Okay, here's your first checkpoint. It says find the product. Negative 1 to the 5th power. Count and see how many negative values we have here. This means we have 5 of them. So that's 5, and this right here is 6. Therefore, that's an even amount, which means it's going to be positive at the end. 1 times itself, and as many times as you want, is still going to be 1 as long as you have the sign correct. So we have 1 times 3, and the whole thing again is going to be positive at the end. Should have 3. Got 3 for that one. Give yourself a pat on the back. Number 2 says simplify the expression. 6 times negative 8t times negative t squared. Again, only t is being raised to the second power, not negative t. Therefore, there are only 1, 2 negative signs here. 2 negative signs means it's going to be positive. So 6 times 8t is going to be 48t, times t is going to be 48t to the third power. So you have to add t to the first plus t squared. Okay, then we talk about some properties of multiplication. We talked about the commutative property of addition. Remember, commute means that it moves from one side to the other. A times B is the same thing as B times A. Notice the same thing with this one. 3 times negative 2 is the same thing as negative 2 times 3. It doesn't matter what order you multiply in. It's still going to be the same. Commutative property of addition was the same thing. 1 plus 2 was the same thing as 1 plus 3. I'm sorry. 1 plus 2 is the same thing as 2 plus 1. The associative property talks about grouping, just like the associative property of addition. Okay, 1 plus 2 plus 3 is the exact same thing as 1 plus 2 plus 3. That was addition. This is multiplication here. So the example given is negative 6 times 2 times 3 is the same thing as multiplying 2 times 3 first, and then multiplying it by negative 6. Again, just like the commutative property, associative property works with it, the order you multiply things doesn't change the outcome. The identity property. Now, this is where the identity property of multiplication is different than it was for addition. The same thing is still true, though. If it's A at the beginning, when you multiply it by 1, it remains A. The identity property for addition, we said A plus 0 still was A. So its identity remained unchanged. The same thing's true with multiplication, except you're not multiplying by 0, because when you multiply by 0, it makes it into 0. So this one, we're just multiplying by 1. So negative 4, for the example, times 1 is the same thing as negative 4. The identity of it doesn't change. It's negative 4 at the beginning and negative 4 at the end. That's the identity property. The property of 0 is when it actually cancels out. See, the property of 0 for addition was like negative 2 plus positive 2. That gave you 0. Okay. The property of 0 for multiplication is easier. You just multiply it by 0 and it becomes 0. So it was A to start and then it becomes 0. Negative 2 times 0 becomes 0. The property of opposites is to turn it into the opposite of itself. So A, when you multiply it by a negative 1, it becomes negative A. That's what you're doing here. So if it was negative 3, if you want to make the opposite out of it, you have to multiply it by negative 1, and it becomes positive 3. So multiplying by negative value gives you a positive, or gives you the opposite. Here's example number 3. Evaluating a variable expression when x is equal to -3. -2 times -3 squared. Now, -3 is the one that's being squared here, which means -3 times -3, which gives you 9. So now you have -2 times 9. Now you have an odd amount of negative values. So it's going to be a negative value at the end. -2 times 9 is -18. On the other one, it says 4 times -x squared. Now it's already negative. This is key right here. It's already negative. We're adding in, or we're simplifying in, or substituting in, I'm using the wrong words, another negative value. So look and see how it looks here. It's already negative, and then you're making it negative again. So you do what's inside the innermost grouping symbol first. Negative times negative, that's an even amount of negatives. So notice it becomes a +3 on this step. So now it's 4 times +3 squared. +3, you do the exponents first. 3 times 3 is 9, and 4 times 9 is 36. Okay, take about a minute and do these two. Okay, we have for A, it says 2 times -x times -x. When you're plugging in or substituting in -7. 2 times -7 times -7. Notice you're putting in double negatives here. So do the innermost ones. This is an even amount. Negative times negative is going to be +7. Even amount, negative times negative is going to be +7. You're left with 2 times 7 times 7. There's no negatives anymore. 2 times 7 is 14, and 14 times 7 is 98. So for B, you have -5 times x, which is -5 times -7 times -2/7. Okay. So you can count how many negative values you got. You got 1, 2, 3. So at the end of this problem, it's going to be an odd amount. That's going to be a negative value. So 5 times 7 is going to be 35. And I'm going to bring that negative down. 5 times 7 is 35. So we have 35, and 35 times 2/7. You can cross cancel that one because the number 7 goes into itself once and into 35 5 times, so that's a whole lot better. 5 times 2 is 10, and we said it's going to be negative originally, so -10 for that one.